Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Be Bold America. I'm your host, Jill Cody. Today our program is The Most Dangerous Organization in America You've Never Heard of. The American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, is a pay-to-play operation in which legislators and corporate lobbyists meet behind closed doors to write model legislation that advances a radical right-wing, pro-corporate, and pro-Republican agenda on everything from suppressing voter access and denying the climate breakdown to crushing unions and undermining public education. ALEC embraced the Christian right extremists who pushed for the nationwide abortion ban, and at last summer's annual meeting, they celebrated the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision that took away a woman's half-right century of freedom over, quote, late night, dessert, and coffee. We have big things to do. Our guest today is Vicki Harrison. Vicki is currently Common Cause's Director of Constitutional Convention and Protecting Dissent Programs. She leads the nonprofit's work on stopping a dangerous constitutional convention that would rewrite the entire United States Constitution. She has built successful lobbying campaigns, election protection programs, local ballot measures, published research and reports, and created coalitions for democracy in New Mexico. Vicki graduated summa cum laude from the University of Mexico with a degree in Women's Studies and African American Studies. Vicki, it is such an honor. Thank you for being our guest today. Welcome to Be Bold America.
Thank you so much for having me, Jill. I'm super excited to talk to you and your listeners about ALEC.
Well, I'm super excited, too, because I have so many questions here, and I've known about ALEC for, several years, but it's still not known what they do. And I did get a listener who saw this topic coming up, and I wanted to share with you what he said, a little bit of what he said. He said, this episode scares him. He said, ALEC...
It does.
It does. ALEC is one of the truly dystopian forces hard at work today. So I thought, wow, what a way to start. Maybe just starting with the... a little bit about what Common Cause does, just, your mission and a little bit of what your responsibilities are, and then we'll get into it.
That sounds fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for having me on the program. And I've been with Common Cause for a little over a decade. Common Cause is an organization we were founded in 1970, right after the Watergate scandal. Our founder, John Gardner, it said that he looked around D.C. and said, where is the people's lobbyist? I see the lobbyist for everybody, but where's the people's lobbyist? So, Jill, we work on things like democracy reform, voting rights, gerrymandering, media in democracy, all sorts of issues. Back in the day, we were the ones working on Open Meetings Acts and mundane things that we thought were pretty easy, like public records, public access to meetings. And then we saw during the pandemic some of those norms thrown completely out the window, and we were back to 1970 again. So we work on, we call ourselves the people's lobbyist, holding power accountable. I always say that we're the ones in state houses and in Congress asking legislators to give up some of that power and do the right thing.
Common Cause just had two big wins a week ago. One was in the state of Oregon, and the other was with the Supreme Court. Just a little bit about that, too, please.
Absolutely. Our win in Oregon was the Oregon State Legislature rescinded all previous calls for a constitutional convention. Now, Jill, they had some old ones on the books, things that had already been accomplished through our amendment process. But cleaning up these old single subject, or as we call them, plenary bills that are asking to rewrite our Constitution is something we do at Common Cause with many of our partners who are trying to stop an Article 5 convention. So not only did Oregon rescind, but in a very contentious state with a very contentious legislature and the walkout of the Senate Republicans, the Senate actually passed it unanimously, which I've never heard of that happening.
That's wonderful.
So that was a huge win.
Wonderful.
That was a huge win to stop folks from rewriting the Constitution, which is like a third of what I do. And our next win, of course, was the only thing good that came out of the Supreme Court this week was the Moore v. Harper decision on this. You know, it's wonky. It's called the independent state legislature theory.
But would it destroy democracy if they voted the other way, right?
Well, exactly. And that's the way I've tried to simplify it. You know, this case started in North Carolina when North Carolina legislature a few years ago did their maps, their redistricting process. They were challenged in court. The North Carolina Supreme Court struck down the maps and said, you have to redo these. These are obviously racially gerrymandered. They are gerrymandered for the Republican Party. And instead of doing that, they challenged it, which basically they were saying, we don't have to listen to you. We don't have to listen to our Constitution. And we can write and establish laws without any review from the governor or the courts. Which, of course, Jill, that's basic democracy.
Exactly.
The three branches.
Exactly. It was stunning that it even got that far.
It's amazing. And I think, especially going through courts, I think, we see everybody with some self-interest, and you would have thought that could have been stopped. So that would have been devastating for our democracy if that would have passed and if they would have not struck that ruling down. So now North Carolina and, Moore v. Harper, Barbara Moore is, one of our North Carolina board members at Common Cause. And so this has been a huge victory for us, along with so many other partners. And it's just, it was one win for democracy this week.
I congratulate Common Cause. They are an awesome and 53-year-old organization, so you're doing something right. And the next thing is let's start talking about the most dangerous organization in America you've never heard of, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. So how long have they been in operation, and what are their successes? Who and what is ALEC?
Well, ALEC is actually celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. They were started back in 1973. Some conservative legislators and conservative activists were like, let's bring together the public and the private. So ALEC became, they call, first of all, let's just say they call themselves a 501c3. They say that they do not do any lobbying and everything they do is education, which is one of the reasons we filed a complaint with the IRS over a decade ago, because it's obvious from anybody who lobbies like we do that what they're doing is lobbying. But they say they're educating. And what they do is they have members who are legislators who pay, again, typically it's $100 every 2 years for a legislator to be a member. And then corporations can be members, and they pay much more, anywhere from $8,000 to $25,000. That was their model for many years. They've now, in recent years, gotten away because we, after Stand Your Ground and their work on voter ID bills, along with many organizations, worked and got literally 125 of their corporate partners to leave. So now they do a lot more. Our partners at the Center on Media and Democracy who try to track their spending, but again, as a C3, it's not public if they don't want it to be, can only identify about a third of their donors. But what they do is they bring people together. They have these task force. Typically, they've had 8 task force that work on different things. You've got legislators, and you've got corporate lobbyists, and you've got business together. And then behind closed doors, they vote on what they call model legislation. And the model legislation is then taken by the legislators at these conferences back to their state houses, and they introduce them like it's their own. They never, for the last 5 decades, nobody ever comes back and says, I got this at an ALEC conference.
Yeah, I know they were caught once, though. I forget what state where the politician handed in the actual document that ALEC had written, and it had ALEC on it. That was one way we all started to know who ALEC was, right? It was just
and that, Jill,
copied over.
Absolutely, because you look at the bills and you're like, wait a minute, these are identical. These are the same exact pieces of legislation that you're acting like is something you came up with. And again, I have people sometimes ask me, well, Vicki, Common Cause, y'all come up with legislation that you're pushing. You're trying to make sure people can vote, and you're doing your campaign finance stuff, and you're, redistricting. But again, we are not monetarily, we're not politically benefiting from passing any of that. Whereas these corporations, ALEC says it's all about reducing government and reducing this excess fiscal spending. But what it really is, and I've heard this many times, it's profit-driven legislation. And that is the problem, because they're obviously lobbying. They are working, they're creating the access. Lobbying, people like to think of it because a company gave you a big check. That big check is just the beginning, Jill. The big check gives you access. That is where the lobbying comes in, is the access. And now they have access. They've been wined, they've been dined at some schmoozy, fancy resort. Again, not lobbying, so in many states they're avoiding disclosing that information.
Well, this is probably a good time to take a break, because right after the break, I wanted to talk about what led up to ALEC. I think, Lewis Powell's memo, to talk a little bit about that, and Paul Weyrich, who started that in the Heritage Foundation. So when we get back, I'll ask you more about those organizations, too. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 89.5, 89.7, and 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the KSQD.org website. Our topic today, the most dangerous organization in America you've never heard of. And our guest is Vicki Harrison, Common Cause's Director of Constitutional Convention and Protecting Dissent Programs. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Hello, K-Squid listeners. I'm Tom Hartman, and each weekday at 4 p.m., I bring you a different perspective on the news than you're likely to hear on most media outlets. Please join me on KSQD Santa Cruz, your ink spot on the dial for the Tom Hartman program, heard now for the first time ever in the Monterey Bay area at 90.7 FM, weekdays at 4 p.m. That's Progressive Talking Conversation with me, Tom Hartman, weekdays at 4 p.m. on KSQD 90.7 FM. Tag, you're it.
We're back. And would you like a friend to hear this interview, the most dangerous organization in America you've never heard of? Well, tell them that this interview and many other Be Bold America interviews are available as a podcast. They may subscribe for free from their favorite podcast platforms such as Apple, Google, Spotify, and Radio Public. Our guest today is Vicki Harrison from Common Cause. She is the Director of Constitutional Convention and Protecting Dissent Programs. You may also learn more by visiting commoncause.org and prwatch.org. Now, Vicki, I don't want to catch you by surprise, but I did want to talk about Lewis Powell.
Oh, absolutely. And you also, Jill mentioned the Heritage Foundation,
yes,
which are, part of this entire thing. And I think that, if you look back, this is all the early 70s when we see these things happening, which is not only when we started, but we've got Watergate. We've got this memo, which, has been, it's been called many, many things, but basically the blueprint for corporate America and how to do it right. And I think that these kinds of conversations, we see the same people in the same room. And we see them whether I'm, talking about ALEC or I'm talking about stopping an Article 5 convention, these are the same folks that we saw morph into things like the Tea Party in, a decade ago.
And the Freedom Caucus now in Congress.
The Freedom Caucus now, which has just moved on and on. And again, the Heritage Foundation and the Koch industry, we can't say the Koch brothers anymore. We have one, but the industry, they have their fingers in all of this. Most states have, Jill, some version, fake nonprofit is what I like to call them, of an ALEC version, some sort of think tank that is being funded by Heritage, the Kochs, that sort of thing. And, laying it out, we have seen so many speeches from these guys back in the 70s, and I wish I could remember where this one came from, but it's at one of these Heritage Foundation things, and, the speaker is literally saying, we don't want people to vote.
Oh, that was Paul Weyrich. Yes, he started ALEC, and he started the Moral Majority, and yes,
and I think it was, and he just said, I can see it clear in my mind. He says, we don't want people to vote. Our stuff does better when people don't vote. And so when people ask me, why would ALEC be interested in voter ID bills, for example? They're not monetarily benefiting from them. And I always say, well, let's stop for a minute, because I always say follow the money on anything. You will find that. But at the same time, if this is part of that same movement, then of course making it harder for people to vote, that's a no-brainer. But, that's again, when we talk about people not knowing about ALEC, Jill, I think, it was a decade ago when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And that's when people heard about ALEC really for the first time. Not people, everybody. Many people knew about them. But really, because not only did we have that happen, but we had a whistleblower at ALEC who turned over a bunch of documents to one of our partners that I mentioned earlier, the Center on Media and Democracy. And they turned over almost 900 model bills.
Wow.
And it was the first time anybody had gotten access to boxes upon boxes of information, because, again, everything is kept behind closed doors. And that's when we started seeing the depth of what they had been working on and the different bills. So we've got that. So 10 years ago, we've got that dump. We've got Trayvon Martin being murdered. And again, ALEC didn't start the Stand Your Ground bill, but what they did after Florida passed it almost 20 years ago was they then took it to another over 20 states and really pushed it for the next 5 years. And so they got a lot of pushback. There was actual media about ALEC, about the Stand Your Ground bill. And then they also started getting a lot of flack about the voter ID bill. So now, in 2023, they have disbanded, quote unquote, these task force. And they're working on other things now that, they say that they review what they're doing every 5 years and move things as necessary.
We were talking about Lewis Powell and Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich, that video is on YouTube, so anyone can go see him actually saying, we don't want everybody to vote. And he was talking about the goo-goo syndrome, people that want good government. He says, we don't want that. So you can actually see him say that in 1973. Just to mention that Lewis Powell's memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was called Attack on American Free Enterprise System. Powell's position was that business was under attack by communists, new leftists, socialists, revolutionaries, college campuses, pulpits, media, intellectual and literary journals, arts and scientists, politicians, Ralph Nader, and Rachel Carson. I mean, he just scared the daylights out of corporate executives back then and turned them into injured parties. Oh my gosh, we have to survive. And to survive, we have to get in touch and manipulate, things with politicians and then Paul Weyrich started the ALEC and the Heritage Foundation. Another thing I think it's important for people to know about the Heritage Foundation is that it was initially funded with $250,000 donation from Joseph Coors, the son of Adolf Coors, the Coors beer family.
And
go ahead.
They're still funders of ALEC.
Yes.
Up until the best we can determine as of 2019, which is the latest we've gotten anything, is they continue to be somebody who funds a lot of that.
Well, to say that ALEC is a 501c3 is really an abomination. I mean...
Well, and that, Jill, has been my issue with them for over a decade. And one of the reasons I was thrilled that we did file the whistleblower complaint. The problem is that we've got so many C3s that are doing this. We have so many that are going beyond lobbying and are actually doing political work. And the IRS has been, the toothless giant for I don't know how long as far as enforcing. And because we see it in administrations defunding the enforcement division. Now, hopefully that's getting better with the latest administration, but it is something that we've seen over and over because, quite frankly, neither party wants the IRS investigating everybody. And
right.
That's not ever been a popular thing. Let's, hold these people accountable. But, it just offends me as somebody who has proudly been an advocate lobbyist for many years for animal rights and abolishing the death penalty and civil legal aid and good government. There is nothing shameful about being a lobbyist, and I register, and I don't buy things. I don't contribute to campaigns. Yet they can create much more of a relationship, do much more lobbying, literally create the bills, and call themselves a C3. We're doing education. So not only are they not having to register, not having to disclose, but think about all the corporations, whether they're donating to them or now they're, moving into sponsoring an event or a panel. That's a tax-deductible donation back to the corporation. It's just insidious.
Also, ALEC seems to frame everything as a monumental moral fight of historic significance. I mean, just the drama, they just keep going that they're in a fight for their lives. The ALEC is where the back room is where the laws are born. I read here, I think maybe from ALEC Exposed. Is ALEC Exposed on that PR Watch website? Vicki,
It is.
Yes,
and
okay.
That's where those initial documents were put and where our partners at CMD are working to continually update that. It's difficult. People ask me all the time, Jill, is my state legislator a member? Is this corporation a member? And I always say, I don't know, kind of. I might know, but everything is in secret. So unless somebody who attends something or somebody who's there talks about it, or we have some places where state legislators are proud of being a member of ALEC and they tell everybody.
Well,
and I think...
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, that really is. They like to continually, and you will hear them in every media blitz they do, talk about being nonpartisan, bipartisan. We have members from every walk of the political spectrum, and it's just not true. They may have a few independents or, unaffiliated voter people that are legislators. They may have a couple of Democrats, but it's overwhelmingly a majority of really conservative Republican legislators who are then, as you mentioned, working behind closed doors on a task force with business, with corporate lobbyists, to decide and vote on which model legislation they're going to push to their members.
We had this with, so far, we've discovered 2 Supreme Court justices that have just taken money from billionaires and gone off to resorts. And does that happen with ALEC? Do they pay for lawmaker trips to go to resorts to get these ready-made bills?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is something that they do. And again, Jill, like you just mentioned, most of this country is horrified that our Supreme Court or our legislators or Congress, we are not that jaded that it doesn't horrify us that they are taking advantage of their position. They're not disclosing it. I used to have some legislators would tell me around campaign finance reports or disclosure, Vicki, I'm following the law. And I used to tell them, Jill, way to scrape the bottom of the barrel, okay? The law is what you have to do.
Right.
Above the law, there's ethics. And then above ethics is your own morality. What is stopping us from doing better? If I were a Supreme Court justice, I would go above and beyond to restore faith. I would feel like it was my job to help the American public even think that we had a shred of dignity left. Instead, we see ALEC doing the same thing. We've heard from legislators who've attended conferences for the last couple of decades about the lavish parties and the free drinks and the cocktails and the cigars and, the golf trips and all of that.
Well, I talk about the law is really the bottom, as you said. It's the final lowest level. And as you mentioned,
you have
ethics,
to do that.
Morals, traditions, norms, values. That's what our democracy is created on. Are those first. Somebody's own character and integrity and trustworthiness, and not being because of those character traits, not being corruptible, and then and then say, well, I'm doing what the law says. It's like, what? You need to do more than that.
You have to do more than that. The law, again, that's the base. That's what you have to do. And nothing prevents people from doing better. And I think anyone who is an elected official or a Supreme Court justice, that's their job to do the right thing. And I always tell people, you've known what was the right thing since you were in kindergarten, and don't tell me you don't, because I know you do know what's right.
Well, in my book, America Abandoned, I talked about anti-character. Simply put, you know it's wrong and you do it anyway. You have these character traits of honesty and integrity and, as I said, trustworthiness. And you know that lying isn't being trustworthy, and not honest. And you do it anyway. So it's intentional anti-character. We don't like character. We don't want to have anything to do with that. And
it's making a choice not to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Because I trust me, every single person before they do the wrong thing, they know in their head they're doing it.
Exactly. You're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 89.5, 89.7, and 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the KSQD.org website. I'm speaking with our bold guest, Vicki Harrison, who is Common Cause's Director of Constitutional Convention and Protecting Dissent Programs. Vicki leads a nonprofit work on stopping a dangerous constitutional convention and who is speaking with us today about ALEC, a pay-to-play organization that writes, in my view, anti-democratic legislation for Republican state legislature adoption. Visit commoncause.org and prwatch.org. We will be right back after Jim Hightower's commentary titled The Secret of Wokeness.
In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Humpty Dumpty scornfully declares that when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean. So what does woke mean? It's become the pet political aspersion that today's kooky right-wing hucksters hurl at liberals. But the hurlers would be whopper-jawed to learn that it was actually coined by and for progressives. Indeed, it admonishes people to be awake to the dangers posed by hate-filled bigots and reactionaries like today's right-wing extremists. Surprising historical tidbit. The first person reported to have used the word was Huddie Ledbetter, the legendary black blues artist known as Leadbelly. Among his many classic songs was Scottsboro Boys, about 9 black teenagers falsely accused in 1931 of raping 2 Alabama white women. As a black musician who traveled the back roads of the Jim Crow South, Leadbelly warned others to pay attention when in a viciously racist state. Best stay woke, he cautioned. But, out of blind ignorance, blind arrogance, or both, Today's adapters of the Jim Crow mentality have perverted common sense wokeness into a verbal whip to lash African Americans, immigrants, Democrats, women, LGBTQ people, and all others they don't like. Pretty much everyone who looks, thinks, prays, and acts different from them. How kooky? They've declared librarians, science, Mickey Mouse, and Bud Light to be their evil enemies. Don't be woke, they bark, demanding autocratic, plutocratic, and theocratic laws to coerce compliance with their own retrogressive bigotries. This is Jim Hightower saying, bear in mind that this is no longer a fringe cult, but the mainstream of the Republican Party, including its top congressional leaders, presidential wannabes, and state officials. Actually, you can easily comprehend what these Humpty Dumptys really mean by their don't be woke war cry. Just substitute the word sane for woke. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is made possible by you subscribers to Jim Hightower's Lowdown on Substack. Find us at jimhightower.substack.com.
Welcome back. My guest today is Vicki Harrison from Common Cause, and our topic is the most dangerous organization in America you've never heard of. Now, Vicki, you mentioned that ALEC sort of relooks at its strategies, their plans every 5 years, and I read that one of ALEC's mission is to combat woke capitalism. What on earth does that mean?
It is madness, Jill. One of their latest things, in addition, they have folks on their, advisory council is what they're now calling them instead of their corporate board, that are part of, oil and gas, energy companies. And so ESG, it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And they are simply factors that many financial firms take into consideration when they're looking to invest. Do you treat your employees right with the governance part? Do you treat your members right? Are you thinking about the planet? These are things that companies, businesses have used, and they don't like this. ALEC and their members do not like this at all, and we saw it in Texas when the governor there said, we will not invest and will not have any company invest our funds for us if you're going to use these principles. So they have been pushing this anti-ESG, anti-woke legislation, and it's kind of become a rallying cry for them. And it's so ridiculous because when you look at it, Jill, you have a lot, as you would fully expect, financial people that are on the other side of this issue. You will see, state treasurers and, investment firms saying this doesn't make any sense. This is just one factor we're using, and it makes no sense just to cripple us when that may be a good factor to think of.
And let's mention the letters again, ESG, because I wasn't really very familiar with the phrase of environmental social governance, ESG factors, and that they were against them. They're against the environmental, against the social, against the governance factors, which include diversity and equity and inclusion as business practices. And so they're looking at...
Which are important business practices, Jill,
yes.
And made even more so by two devastating Supreme Court rulings this week.
Yes.
Think about that. I mean, this is just more of, and this is just saying you can't take that into consideration. And if you do, you can't manage our money. Cripple. And that's what the folks in Texas said. The financial people were like, okay, and this was even if you used it with another client or there was branding on your website that talked about being a decent human being. I mean, it went so far that financial companies were like, we can't even manage this. We don't even know how to separate that from what we've been doing for years.
Well, I laugh only because I don't want to cry, because this is taken seriously by many companies, and or they'll try to figure out how to address it in their corporations because ALEC is so powerful. And one thing that I don't think you mentioned when you were talking about the difference between what you do and Common Cause does with ALEC is the amount of money behind each of these organizations. ALEC is flush with money, and Common Cause is a true 501c3 nonprofit. It doesn't.
We are, well, and we are also a C4, and
that's right.
Is the lobbying,
right.
And that is, in fact, which is very different in this country. Most people have a C3 and a C4, but we were only a C4 until 2002 when we created our education fund. We literally were all lobbying for 32 years, which is what ALEC has been doing the same time. And, of course, never disclosing it in any state and continuing to say with a straight face, we are only doing education. We never lobby.
This comes down to, in reality, this combating woke capitalism is that they want states to blacklist companies that divest from fossil fuels. That's attack against trying to do anything to stop the breakdown of our climate. They want to prohibit anyone managing state, local, or university pension funds, public pension funds, from considering the climate emergency or other social and political factors when investing these pension funds. What I also see, and I don't think many people really spend much time about because it's kind of boring, but when you talk about environmental, social, and governance factors, you're really talking about the commons. In a democracy, we come together and as a people to fund and manage what we call the commons. I can't have my own sewer system. I don't want to know where that goes when I flush the toilet. I mean, I can't have my own library system. I can't have my own fire department. I can't have my own police department. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And we come together as people to work for the commons, and yet I see what ALEC is saying about when they use environmental, social, and governance is really trying to destroy the commons. And they say, quote unquote, ESG investing is socialism in sheep's clothing. Now, supporting the commons is not socialism. The state doesn't own the company. The state isn't running the corporation. It is social behavior in coming together, but it is not socialism. And this is what drives me crazy, is that they're successfully mixing those two. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and it's the same fear tactics that we just spoke about with the Powell memo. I mean, these are socialist ideas to think about the environment, the social welfare of our country, and your governance, like your board of directors. How do you treat your staff? I mean, it's just more. I mean, of course, these are the same people that pushed the right to work laws, that worked with Scott Walker and many others to try to cripple unions in our country. And, when you look at the things that they have worked on, I mean, bail bonds, I mean, this with the ESG is not surprising at all. And it makes sense for them because they want to protect the big energy. I mean, this is, making sure that, you can't have a protest near a pipeline. I mean, the other part of my job is working to protect the First Amendment. Jill, if you would have asked me 10, 15 years ago I needed to do that, I would say there's attorneys out there that have been doing this and they're in courts and, the idea in America that we can't protest is absolutely absurd. Or that if we do protest, it's okay if somebody runs over us because we're standing in the street.
To make it legal to run over somebody.
Absolutely. Or to say, as long as I am not inconvenienced, it's okay. We've seen these bills for years trying to come up. I used to work on animal rights issues, and we would see bills coming up saying you can't stand on public property and videotape an animal operation. And I was just like, wait a minute, that's totally illegal. They can't do that. It's public property. But this is something that we see continuing with the ESG and the climate. I'm trying to remember the name of one of their bills they had a few years ago around the Energy Discrimination Act.
It's always the opposite
really
I know, opposite of what it does.
And they said,
right.
they're like, this is more wokeness, and they're discriminating by saying they're not going to invest in companies that, are doing X, Y, and Z. And again, the financial folks, Jill, are saying, wait a minute, why are state legislators who may know nothing about the financial markets deciding what we're going to do for state employee pensions?
And just shifting the conversation a little bit, because I don't want to miss out on it, is ALEC's position on a woman's freedom of choice, liberty to make her own decision. Talk a little bit about ALEC's position on taking away half a century right that women had.
They chaired it, and they have members who have been working for decades to reverse that decision. And this is more of, as you mentioned, this really conservative right movement. And there's so many things that we probably won't get to, and I hope your listeners look it up, because not only do we have them cheering and, saying we're going to do everything we can to make sure this gets passed in state houses as well around a woman's right to choose. We've got the privatization of education, which is one of the scariest things for me to even think about as somebody who loves education, and the way they have manipulated bills around privatization of education, online education schools, which, you can literally see somebody write the bill. I always think of that K-12, that's this online schooling, which people got terrible schooling with and built millions out of many state governments. And, it's the right to work. We just barely mentioned that, but that was a big campaign that they have pushed in many states. We've seen it. I live in New Mexico, and they couldn't get it passed at the state level, so they started passing it, Jill, in counties, county by county. And it would be after people had attended an ALEC conference, and they would come back fresh with their bills. There's a lot of issues. As I said, a decade ago, Lisa Graves was given 850-something bills.
Wow. And county by county takes a lot of money and a lot of person power. Well, I read on ALEC that ALEC stated regarding women's freedom of choice, they said that state legislators should have the authority to decide what is best for women and their personal health. That's really a state legislator decision. It's just...
It's horrifying, because they love to bring up the states' rights argument when it makes sense to them.
Right.
And they use it, and it's, again, it's frustrating. I tell people I work on voting, and nothing frustrates young people more than when they understand that every state has their own system for primary elections. So by the time you get to the general, you're literally comparing apples and oranges. There are certain things that should not be left up to the state to decide. Whether somebody can vote and whether somebody has control over their own body, I think would be a couple of them.
Exactly.
And they know that they're pushing this, because then they're going to turn around and push it in Congress. Because, as we know, many of our state legislators then become congressional members. They become U.S. senators. And while some of them may be proud of their ALEC connection, many of them are going to hide it, and you don't know. And trying to track the bills when you don't even necessarily know what issues they're working on, unless something is leaked, is incredibly difficult. So I always tell people when they ask me, is this an ALEC bill? I'm like, you need to Google some of that. You need to reach out to the organizations that are working on that bill. Find out where it came from. If you are an advocate who works for a nonprofit, you're lobbying in California, and you see a bill, find out the other partners. Go to the Legislative Council Services and who drafted that bill, and find out who wrote this bill, who sent you this language. Where did it come from?
If you're just joining us, our topic is the most dangerous organization in America you've never heard of. And my bold interview guest is Vicki Harrison, Common Cause's Director of Constitutional Convention and Protecting Dissent Programs. Vicki leads the nonprofit's work on stopping a dangerous constitutional convention and who is talking to us today about ALEC that writes dangerous anti-democratic legislation. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 89.5, 89.7, and 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Tune into KSQD at 6 p.m. for State of Mind, hosted by Santa Cruz licensed psychotherapist Deborah Sloss. About 1/3 of people with a mental health condition also develop a substance use disorder at some point in their lives. In this episode, we discuss the complicated intersection of these problems afflicting nearly 17 million Americans. Deborah speaks with psychotherapist Cynthia Nolenberger and Rick, an artist and musician who shares his journey to mental health recovery and substance use recovery. This 2019 interview has been updated with new material and new stories. That's State of Mind this evening at 6 p.m. here on KSQD 90.7 FM and ksqd.org.
We're back, and we're speaking with Vicki Harrison from Common Cause. Now, Vicki, what is their end game, or do they even have one? What is ALEC end game?
Well, Jill, they say what they want is fiscal responsibility in D.C., that they want, and again, which is such an overlap with my work to stop an Article 5 convention, which the two biggest campaigns pushing that, Balanced Budget Amendment and Convention of States, has that as part of their platform.
Well, tell us more about the convention that they're trying to put together, and how close are they?
Well, Balanced Budget Amendment has 28 states. They need 34 to call a constitutional convention. And the Convention of States, which is the one that Mark Meckler runs, is at 19 right now. And those are the two that are the closest. And, again, Jill, Article 5 in our Constitution gives us two ways to change the Constitution. The first one is the amendment process, which people know about. We've done it 27 times. The second one is called a constitutional convention, which if you can get 34 states to call it, you have a convention, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That has not happened since the last time since we wrote our Constitution. 1787 is the last time that was done. And the guys that sat down and wrote our Constitution, Jill, threw out the rules they themselves had just created. So the idea of a constitutional convention for Common Cause, there are entirely too many unknowns. It could be a runaway convention. They could change the rules. Who are going to be the delegates? There's nothing in Article 5 that mentions does Congress have a role once they call it? The courts are not mentioned. What could happen? Are we going to have one delegate from each state? Once they get there, can they propose anything like they did when they wrote our there's just so many unknowns. And we've got people across the political spectrum that are against this. Even though these two major campaigns currently are being run by primarily Republicans, we have many Republicans in this country who are staunchly against an Article 5 convention, which we just saw in Oregon when every single state senator voted to rescind previous calls. So it's a wonky issue, but it's a dangerous one. We have a former board member at Common Cause, that says about an Article 5 convention, why would you set your house on fire and then pray the fire department got there in time? Because we just don't know. There's so many unknowns. And so, but their biggest thing, Convention of States wants to do the fiscal thing around, governments. And, you listen to these guys, Jill, in these state houses across the country talking about how out of control DC is and their spending, and I can't help it. I get a little petty, and I have to Google the state and how much of their budget comes from the federal government. And every time it's ridiculously high. And so they don't even listen to themselves when they're saying the government spends too much money. And that's what the balanced budget amendment, the other one that's at 28 states. Can you imagine a balanced budget amendment for the federal government during the pandemic, during anything, which is why we have a broad spectrum of support. But unfortunately, we've got these two Republican campaigns that are doing their best to make it partisan right now.
Well, when they just say fiscal responsibility, how do they define that? Because, most of our recessions, I think 8 out of 9 of them, I'm not quite sure of the numbers, don't quote me, were recessions created by Republican administrations because they just spend, and then the Democrats have to have in and correct it all. I mean,
some of their information that they send out, Jill, is pretty startling. I mean, they, have said, get rid of the IRS, get rid of the Department of Education, get rid of the Environment Department, get rid of the Health Department. Pass a policy saying we will never raise taxes and we're going to lower everything to a flat tax. I mean, some of the stuff, we're going to get rid of the Affordable Health Care Act. I mean, they think fiscal responsibility in D.C. is eliminating departments. We don't need the Environment Department. We don't need the Interior Department.
Well, I think most people
need the education.
I don't think most people know that is a libertarian platform, and there's been no successful libertarian government in the world ever. And it's a libertarian platform. That's what David Koch, who passed away a few years ago, ran on when he ran for vice president. It was just to repeal all the finance laws, abolish Medicare and Medicaid, repeal Social Security, abolish the U.S. Post Office. I mean, they went on and on. No public schools, privatize all the roads, privatize everything. No FAA. You can't have safe airplanes. I mean, if anybody wants to know, just look up David Koch's vice presidential campaign platform. It was a libertarian ticket, and that is what they are still fighting for today. No regulations on anything, and who doesn't want regulations? The people that don't want regulations are those that think it gets in their way of making money or gets in their way. Go ahead.
Absolutely, Jill. And whether we're talking about the campaigns for the Article 5, again, which ALEC is very much in support of, and you talk about one of the things ALEC has pushed is tort reform. I mean, they have pushed, private prisons. I mean, it's all about the bottom line and what they're going to make out of it. I mean, it's just a matter of to me, it's like everything that is a current government service, something that we can rely on for the common good, would be taken over by business, by private interests, who are then going to turn around and make money off of it, which we have seen with whether we're talking about bail reform or private prisons or any of these things.
What I say to people is that if corporations really were a person, even though legally now they're treated like that, but if they really were a person, they'd be a psychopath, because a corporation can't have compassion, empathy, humility, and it just seems that those psychopathic, the lack of any compassion is what leads to the environmental, social, and governance platforms that they work on to destroy anything that would deal with clean water. That, to me, is psychopathic, to not want other people to have clean water to drink. I mean, that's what America is about, is having clean water and air where many other third world countries don't. So in this last minute, just what do you think listeners could keep doing, stop doing, and start doing to help your cause and common cause's cause?
Oh, isn't that great? I think, Jill, that what people can keep doing is keep being engaged, talking to their friends and family about issues that matter to them and getting them engaged. Nothing convinces somebody else to get involved more than a friend or family member. And stop doing, I don't really know. I think we're all doing our best post-pandemic. So if you're doing something that's not healthy, I'm going to raise a glass to you and say, keep doing it. Mm-hmm. But what you could do in the future is make sure that you reach out to those nonprofits that are working, whether they're doing it in Congress or in the State House in California. Get involved. If you care about immigration rights or women's issues or whatever, education, find those organizations that are doing that work and get involved. Find out how to stop ALEC before it becomes a law in your state.
Well, and you'll find, too, that getting involved, you meet new people, you have fun, you get included in other groups, and it really gives life a sense of meaning. Vicki, thank you for being our bold... Thank you.
We need volunteers.
Yes, everybody needs the volunteers. Thank you so much for being our bold and impressive guest today. I'm so grateful of your time, and it was such an honor. Thank you, Vicki, for joining us on Be Bold America today.
Thank you for having me, Jill.
And I want to remind listeners to visit commoncause.org and prwatch.org. What's up next on Be Bold America? Please join us on Sunday, July 16th, when friend of the show, Thom Hartmann, returns for his fourth visit. This #1 progressive talk show host will be telling us about his most recent book, The Hidden History of American Democracy. Democracy is the default state of virtually every animal species on Earth, and humanity is no exception. Only with the power of great wealth, control of media, or the force of arms and technology is it overcome by dictators, popes, and kings. In Tom's powerful sweeping history and analysis of American democracy, he shows how democracy is the one form of government most likely to produce peace and happiness among people. Now our democracy is under targeted threat. So how do we save the longest-lasting democracy in the world? Don't miss The Hidden History of American Democracy with Thom Hartmann, and join Be Bold America on Sunday, July 16th at 5 p.m. As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you may listen to the show anytime for free by subscribing to Apple, Google, and other platforms. I want to give a special thank you to Be Bold America's program engineer, Eliza James, and to our station's program director, Howard Feldstein. You are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, Prunedale. Many voices, one station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org. Stay tuned for State of Mind with Deborah Schloss. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start.